I'm sitting in a quiet corner of my living room, away from the windows, where I can see the front door clearly, but nobody passing by can see me. Every night for the past 2 weeks, a police officer has knocked on that door around 4 in the morning, claiming he needs to search the premises for evidence. At first, it felt like a bizarre misunderstanding, maybe something involving the previous owners. But I've come to realize it's far more sinister. He's been here night after night, always at the same time, always wearing the same grim expression. He says there's an ongoing investigation tied to my address. The strangest part is, once I let him in, he hardly asks me any questions at all. Instead, he goes from room to room, opening drawers, looking behind furniture, tapping on the walls in search of something. Then he'll excuse himself with a vague apology and step outside, disappearing almost as soon as he came. I moved into this house 6 months ago, not long after transferring from a different city for my job. It's a decent place. 2 stories, a small backyard, a basement that smelled faintly of mold until I bleached it thoroughly, and enough space for a couple of housemates if I ever decided to rent out. The listing never mentioned anything unusual about the property's history, nor did any neighbor warn me about a tragedy or rumor. For the first few months, I settled in easily, painting a few rooms, getting the lawn in shape, making the place feel like mine. Life was ordinary and uneventful. Things changed one Tuesday night. I fell asleep around midnight as usual, only to wake at 4 in the morning to a persistent knock at the door. It took me a while to realize what was happening. My phone read 4:07 a.m. The knocking persisted at a measured pace. Knock, knock, knock. A short pause, then repeat. No doorbell, just that same drumming against the wood. I got out of bed thinking maybe it was a neighbor with an emergency, or someone too disoriented to realize they had the wrong house. When I cracked the door open, a man in a police uniform greeted me. He wore a neatly pressed shirt with a badge, a standard utility belt, and a high-peaked cap that obscured half his forehead. In the faint light of my porch lamp, I saw lines around his eyes. He looked old enough to have served a couple of decades on the force. He didn't smile or frown, just spoke in a steady voice, explaining he was investigating a case connected to this address and needed to come inside. His request, though abrupt, felt official enough that I stepped aside, puzzled but yielding. I asked if I could see his ID, but he flashed it too quickly for me to read the name, and I felt too drowsy to push the point. The next thing I knew, he was inside, scanning the entry hall like someone reacquainting themselves with a familiar space. He asked if I'd lived here long, then walked past me into the living room, his gaze moving from the fireplace to the sofa. He touched the banister on the staircase, pressed a hand against the wall as though checking for hidden compartments. I asked him what the case involved, but he offered only vague references. An incident that may have left evidence in the house. After about 15 minutes of rummaging around, opening closets, shining his flashlight into corners, he turned to me and said, "Everything's fine for tonight. I'll be back if I need more." And with that, he left, leaving me at my front door in a confused state, unsure if I'd dreamed the encounter. The next day, I reasoned it must have been something routine. Maybe the police got a tip about the house. I told a friend at work about it, half laughing at how odd the situation was, but he urged me to be careful, suggesting I ask for official documentation next time. I intended to do just that, but I wasn't sure how often or whether he'd come back at all. Then it happened again. The very next night, 4:03 a.m., the same rhythmic knock on the door. This time, I was more alert. I flipped on the porch light, peered through the window, and saw the same policeman standing there. I opened the door a crack and asked to see his ID properly. He held it up for a moment, Let me see a name I'll call Officer Donahue. The badge glinted, looked authentic enough. He repeated that this property remained under investigation for a serious matter and that cooperation was critical. The way he spoke had a resolute tone, no invitation for debate. Against my better judgment, I let him in again. He did the same routine, pacing through the rooms as though checking them against a mental blueprint. Sometimes he bent down to run his fingers along the baseboards, or lightly tapped the walls, or peered behind a dresser. I asked if he needed a warrant, and he said, "We have special authorization. It's complicated. You wouldn't want to impede a police investigation, would you?" Then, satisfied with whatever he was or wasn't finding, he left without any further explanation. After that second time, I really began to worry. My instincts told me something was off. Why always 4 in the morning? Why no paperwork? Why the same quiet rummaging in corners with no direct questions about me or my possessions? 2 nights later, it happened a third time. Same hour, same unceremonious knock. I decided to record the conversation on my phone, but as soon as he entered, he spotted the phone in my hand. In a calm yet unsettling tone, he told me to put it away, citing confidential matters of the case. He moved about faster that night, as if he suspected my intentions. Before leaving, he said, "I know you have no involvement, but we need to keep the public safe. If you see or find anything that looks old or suspicious around the property, do not dispose of it. Let us handle it." After that third visit, I felt compelled to do some digging. I searched online for Officer Donahue in local police rosters. A name appeared in older documents, but it was associated with a policeman who'd been on the force years earlier, rumored to have resigned abruptly. No recent records indicated he was still an active officer. My immediate plan was to contact the police station directly and confirm if this man really worked there. That's when I discovered the station had no officer by that name employed. The clerk told me maybe the individual was from a neighboring jurisdiction, but it was suspicious enough that I asked her to run the badge number. She told me it didn't match their current records. My heart sank. Something was very wrong. I considered changing my locks, but realized that wouldn't stop him from knocking at 4 a.m. if he truly wanted inside. Besides, he had an unsettling authority in his manner, as though the walls of my house were no barrier to him. So I took a different approach. I stayed awake the next night with all the lights off and waited near a window to see if he'd arrive. At 4:05, his silhouette drifted into view on the sidewalk, coming from the direction of an abandoned lot. He approached my door precisely as before. This time, I didn't answer, hoping he'd go away. He knocked for about 5 minutes, then quietly tried the doorknob. It was locked. Eventually, I heard him sigh, step off the porch, and leave. The next day, driven by anxiety and curiosity, I began asking neighbors about my house's history. One older woman across the street recalled that the house used to belong to a policeman and his wife. This was maybe a decade ago. The wife apparently vanished under odd circumstances, and soon after the policeman sold the place. She couldn't remember his name, but described him as tall, stoop-shouldered, had a severe face, prone to wearing hats even off duty. It had to be the same man who kept coming here. I felt a pit in my stomach. I pressed the neighbor for details, but she didn't know much beyond rumor. Some said the wife ran off with another man. Others whispered that something darker had happened. Later, I tried searching news archives for the address, seeking any mention of a missing person or a murder investigation. I came across a single short article from years back. The policeman's wife had disappeared and no official suspect was named. The policeman resigned from the force around that time. The piece concluded with a note that the wife's family believed she wouldn't have left without contacting someone, but no body was ever found. The policeman eventually sold the house. That was it. No updates, no closure. She was never declared dead, just missing. Putting these pieces together made me question whether the policeman, the same Officer Donahue, was behind her disappearance. Maybe he'd gotten away with murder, never indicted due to lack of evidence. If that was true, then what was he doing coming back to my house at 4 a.m.? The neighbor's rumor suggested he once co-owned the property with his ex-wife. Was he searching for hidden remains or for something he left behind? Could it be that all these years later, some fear or guilt was driving him to revisit the scene? I hypothesized that he might suspect some piece of evidence remained in the walls, floorboards, or basement. Each night he arrived to check, either to confirm it was still hidden or to remove it. Perhaps in his mind, he believed the police might quietly be building a case against him, so he was preempting it by systematically destroying anything incriminating. The notion that a murderer was pacing my halls under the guise of an officer of the law chilled me, but I told myself to remain level-headed and gather proof. During his next knock, this time I waited until 4:10, I answered the door, but refused him entry. I said something like, "I researched this house and I know about your wife. You have no right to barge in here." His face remained impassive for a moment. Then he gave a hollow laugh. He insisted he was on official business, brandishing the same badge. Before I could respond further, he said if I refused him entry, I'd be obstructing an ongoing murder investigation. I shot back, "A murder that you committed, right?" That was the first time I saw a flicker of real emotion on his face. His eyes hardened, and he forced a half smile that looked more like a grimace. "Let me in," he repeated. Under that intense gaze, some instinct in me faltered. Perhaps I worried he might become violent. I opened the door just enough for him to slip in. This time, I followed close behind as he moved from room to room. My presence seemed to irritate him. In the living room, he knelt by a patch of floor near the fireplace, tapped it and muttered to himself. Then in the hallway, he prodded the baseboards with a small flathead screwdriver from his pocket. I demanded to know what he was doing, but he refused to answer. I asked if he'd killed his wife, and he let out a low chuckle. "You meddle in things that don't concern you," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. The basement was his final stop that night. As soon as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he ran his flashlight along the perimeter, pausing at an old shelving unit built against the wall. He pried open a loose panel behind it, rummaging with an urgency that made me think he'd done this many times before. After a few minutes, he retreated, straightened up, and gave me a curt nod. Without explanation, he headed back up and out the front door. I stood there, uncertain whether I should confront him or call for help. By the time my thoughts settled, I heard his footsteps departing across the yard. Once again, I had no proof that would stand up in court. No video evidence, just my word against his. I spent the next day tearing the basement apart, pulling boxes away from the shelves, looking for the loose panel he'd inspected. I found an area behind the shelving where a segment of the wall was replaced at some point. The plaster looked slightly mismatched in color and texture, as though someone had repaired it decades ago. I tapped around, but it sounded mostly solid. Maybe the policeman had hidden something inside, or maybe removed something on one of his earlier visits. I took pictures with my phone, but they showed nothing obviously suspicious. Just a patch of older plaster. Exhaustion set in. At night, I forced myself to stay awake until 4 a.m., sure he would come again. But he didn't. That was one of the strangest nights. waiting for something that never happened, jumping at every faint noise from outside. By dawn, I collapsed into a restless sleep. A few nights later, I was awakened at exactly 3:58 a.m. by the scratch of footsteps on my porch. The policeman rapped on the door again, this time more insistent. I hesitated, uncertain whether to open it. He called my name, my actual name, through the wood, threatening that if I didn't comply, I'd regret it. My courage failed. I cracked the door open. He pushed past me, face set in a furious line, ignoring any greeting. "You've been prying, haven't you?" he said. He marched into my living room, checking behind the sofa. It occurred to me he might suspect I found something and stashed it there. Then he did his methodical search around the ground floor. His presence was suffocating. The entire time I tried to act calm, but my insides churned with a sense of violated security in my own home. Eventually, he returned to the basement. I followed, determined not to let him out of my sight. He shone his flashlight around once more, focusing on that repaired patch in the plaster. He muttered curses under his breath as though he couldn't remember precisely where or how he'd hidden something. "It has to be here," he said to nobody in particular. I demanded answers, stepping closer than I ever had before. He paused, turned, and fixed me with a stare that almost pinned me in place. He confessed bits of his secret. Years ago, this house belonged to him and his ex-wife. Their marriage was failing, culminating in violent arguments. One night, things escalated, and she didn't survive. He claimed it was an accident, that he didn't mean to do it, though his voice lacked genuine remorse. Facing the potential ruin of his career, he concealed her remains somewhere in the house, then staged her disappearance. The local police eventually gave up on the case, citing a lack of evidence. He sold the property, left the force, and tried to start anew, all the while frightened that some overlooked piece of evidence might incriminate him if discovered. As the years passed, a recurring terror gripped him. The idea that an investigation might quietly reopen, or that some new occupant would stumble upon her remains, or a personal item of hers hidden in the walls. That's why, from time to time, he returned at the dead of night to search. The hour was critical, he said, less likely that neighbors would notice, and a time that felt connected to the final hours he spent with his ex-wife. He spat out these confessions with a mixture of anger and desperation. I stood there, gripping a flashlight of my own, feeling that at any moment he might see me as an obstacle to remove. I demanded he leave my house. He gave a humorless laugh. "Leave? I'm not done." He turned back to the wall, tapping it, pressing his ear against the plaster. Finally, I gathered the courage to say I'd call the police if he didn't get out. That word, police, struck him like a nerve. He whipped around, shouting that I knew nothing, that I had no proof except hearsay. He rummaged in his coat pocket, and for a second, I feared he'd pull a weapon. Instead, he brandished a small crowbar. My heart felt like it wanted to leap out of my chest, but I told him if he pried at my walls, I'd call the real police, the ones who would actually arrest him. He stared me down for a long moment, then slowly put the crowbar away. He walked back up the stairs, tension radiating from him. As he reached the front door, he turned and said, "If anything's still here, I'll find it. And if you get in my way, there'll be another missing person associated with this house." Then he vanished into the darkness outside. I locked the door after him, adrenaline coursing through me. Dawn found me sitting at the kitchen table, uncertain what to do next. If I informed the police about his confession, I had no tape recording, no credible proof that an ex-cop was haunting my house, rummaging for old evidence of murder. And if I tried to break the plaster in the basement to see what was behind it, I might be destroying potential evidence that real investigators could use. Plus, the thought of stumbling on anything horrifying set my nerves on edge. But the worst part was knowing he might appear any night at that same dreadful hour, crowbar or worse in hand. For the next week, I slept in short bursts, always waking around 3:30 to prepare for the possibility of him returning. But he never came during that time. I found it hard to leave the house, worried that he might slip in while I was gone. Eventually, I started noticing I was losing track of time at work or skipping lunches. My life revolved around waiting for that 4 a.m. knock. I spent hours scouring every inch of the basement, hoping to unearth the hidden item or remains that fueled his frantic searches. But all I found was chipped plaster and rotted wood. Maybe he'd already removed the evidence. Maybe he was just double-checking. Maybe he was unraveling. In desperation, I called the station again, telling them an ex-officer might be involved in a decades-old disappearance. They assured me they would look into it if I gave them a name, but I only had the partial ID from old archives, Officer Donahue. That name turned up no active leads, no open files. Without a conclusive link, they couldn't just stake out my property. I ended the call feeling more alone than ever. I remain in a state of dread, uncertain how to end this. At night, I pace the hallway, checking outside windows, half expecting to see him gliding across my yard. Sometimes I wake at 4 a.m. out of sheer habit, bracing for that stern knock. My phone is ready to record anything, but he hasn't come again. Maybe he found what he needed, or maybe he's waiting for me to let down my guard. Neighbors have started noticing my restless behavior, but nobody suspects the real reason. I tell them I have insomnia or an intense project at work. They accept it. Meanwhile, I'm haunted by the thought that I'm living in a house where a woman's life ended and her killer returns to erase the last traces of his guilt. I imagine him lying awake too, consumed by old memories and fear of discovery until that primal urge drives him back to this place. If you're reading this, believe that everything I've described is real. If you own a home with a murky past, be cautious of strangers appearing at dawn in the guise of authority. Some secrets linger in walls and floorboards, refusing to remain buried. I haven't decided whether to stay here hoping he never shows up again, or to move out and let the next occupant deal with the unspoken horror. But if I leave, I feel I'll be abandoning any chance of revealing what truly happened to his ex-wife. That policeman may be out there every morning at 4, drifting through empty streets to scavenge bits of evidence from old rooms. Or maybe he's right behind the front door, waiting for me to open it in a state of half-sleep. No matter how mundane the house might appear, it's become a silent stage for a private tragedy, replayed in the dark hours before the world awakens. I'll keep these notes hidden in the attic or somewhere he won't look. If one day I vanish, or if I walk away for good, I hope someone finds them. Let them serve as a record of how a man wearing a uniform but driven by guilt can keep returning to a crime scene long after everyone else has forgotten. The door between us might hold for now, but at 4 in the morning, every knock shakes my sense of security to the core. If I ever find the courage to break open that patch of plaster in the basement, I might confirm all my suspicions about what he left behind. For now, though, my nights remain watchful, counting down to that dreaded hour when the policeman might return to finish whatever he started.